Second of the social history, I just wanted to start out with just sort of, I mentioned this last time and I forgot to put up an image. This is an image, again, of the first emperor's warriors, part of his bodyguard for the first emperor's tomb. And again, when you look at these faces, if you notice, they're not the same face. They're not Xeroxes of each other's. They're different. They've even got different postures, different poses. Different units or different groups have different hairstyles, which we think probably were related to where these guys were from. So they weren't from one place. We know that the Qin military was incredibly brutal and incredibly structured, also incredibly efficient. So it's these guys were sort of, if you want to think of the elite of the elite. But nonetheless, it says something when you realize you've got 25, 35,000 full size, actually full size, over 2 meter high guys. So people had to cast all these figures. They had to build the buildings around them. They had to make all the weapons for them. Specialists had to make all the faces. And I'm pretty sure we're pretty sure that they were actually copying these off of, off of the originals, i.e. the living guys. So it just gives you some idea of the complexity of what was going on and how important it was to deal with the ritual and the ancestral aspects of life. Now, we now sort of segue through almost 1,000 years of Chinese history. So they have the Xia dynasty, replaced by the Shang dynasty. That's collapsed and then replaced by the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty stays in power again for about 200 or 300 years. And then what happens is their central authority starts to erode and these separate states come out. And so you end up with the Warring States period, as it's oftentimes called, which is entirely accurate. Now, if you want to see sort of a version of this, the original movie Hero from 20 something years ago deals with the sort of latter part of this. So what happens is you have these different states. The one to the west, which actually wasn't considered Chinese and certainly wasn't Han by the others. And I should point out that China was a very complex place ethnically on one hand. And so again, as I mentioned last time, you had this idea of very different clans. People can be in proximity of each other, but they don't see themselves as being the same. Having said that, they shared a fair amount. It's very likely that they shared sort of a common language, or probably real very strong dialectic variations. They shared some common writing, but there was a lot of variation from, and I think probably intentional, from one of these kingdoms or one of these regions to another. They did things differently, and I think intentionally to be different. And so what you have is these various kingdoms replacing the centralized authority of the Zhou. In the Western region, not actually Han. A new one of these dynasties starts up called the Qin. They're based more in the horse cultures of what later would be considered sort of Mongolia and Manchuria. So they're different. To the Chinese, they didn't see them as Chinese. The Chinese saw them as sort of insider outsiders, but they weren't seen as part of the system. So eventually, what happens is over a long period of time, about 300 years, the Qin start to consolidate power. They end up with a series of very smart rulers and obviously very good military, and eventually they kick the butt of everyone else that end up in charge. Now, it's really striking, and apparently all the sources teams seem to agree that the guy that becomes the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, Di just means emperor, so Qin Shi Huang was his name. Shi Huang was his family name. Qin was just sort of the clan label. So if what is the clan, it's the Qin kingdom, and he's the king in charge. Now he's taken over all the other kingdoms, so he now controls. If you remember that the image of Google Earth, he now controls all of the sort of northern central flat areas of China and a lot of the mountain areas to the west too. But he realized very quickly, I mean, obviously he was a sharp bugger. He realized that when something happened to him, when his son or maybe his grandson took over, that they'd be right back where they started from. That all these other guys would come back into power, and they'd end up back in another series of civil wars. And these civil wars had lasted for almost 400 years. And he decided, well, enough of that bullshit. This wasn't going to happen under his watch. And so what he did is he decided that the way to deal with this is two things. The main one is what you had to do is you had to cut back the power of the clans. And so what he came up with a whole set of incredibly impressive and very, very sophisticated strategies to cut back the authority of basically his competition. Now, ironically, also he had to be careful because he obviously cut back his own authority too. So what he did is he replaced the idea of the clan with the idea of what we would call the bureaucracy. In fact, you could argue in many ways the Chinese come up with the first real bureaucracy. Maybe the Babylonians did, I'm not sure, about the same time. So what happens is he decides that, well, the way to get rid of the folks in the clan that are actually any good is to give them something better. And so what he does is he sets up the idea of the first imperial state. This is entirely a Chinese invention. As far as we can tell, all sorts agree. He actually thought this up. So it wasn't like a group of folks over a long period of time and it evolved. He sort of like sat down for a bunch of months, I think probably when they're having these wars, and figured out, okay, how are we going to get out of this cycle, this perpetual cycle of disaster? And he comes up with the idea of a centralized authority. And with that, the centralized authority then becomes that guy to take this mandate of heaven. Is that if you've been given the mandate of heaven by the ancestors, then no one can argue with that, in the sense of it's obvious. And so he calls himself the Emperor D. This is a new term, didn't exist before. So he now becomes Qin Shi Huang Di, the Emperor of China, not the king of the Qin kingdom, but the Emperor of China, of Qin. In fact, that's the word China. When we think of China today, that means the Empire of Qin. So that's part of his, and that's all intentional on his part. He comes up with a standardized writing system, and everyone under pain of death has to start using the Qin symbols in the Qin writing system instead of whatever they used before. People can speak whatever they want to at home, but if they're going to work for the government, if they're going to be in the military, if they're going to have anything to do with anything that the central government, you have to speak Qin, or more accurately, Han Chinese. So he centralizes the language, centralizes the script system, starts this idea of imperial worship. Of course, he does the main part of it himself. He worships his ancestors. And he argues, since he's the emperor, this is actually worshiping for everyone in China. So when he passes, you should worship for him, because then he'll put in a good word with you for the other older ancestors. He then sets up these ideas of these highly centralized bureaucratic centers. The main one being in Xiang'an, which later becomes called Chang'an. This is a movie set, ironically, which still exists. It's sort of cool. It's sort of bizarre, but it's sort of cool. And this is actually in Xi'an, which used to be Chang'an. So it's based on a semi-accurate reconstruction of one of the palaces of the Han Dynasty. And you'll see this thing in I don't know how many movies, especially now that Chinese are really into, historical TV dramas. You see this thing show up all the time. Really well done. It's a beautiful building. But this is just one palace. And this would have been, it's actually only quarter size. The original Han Palace or Qin Palace in Chang'an was 4 times as large as this. And it had 6 other wings to the side of it. So the whole thing was absolutely enormous. And that was intentional. He was making things bigger than anyone had ever made them before to make it clear to everyone he wasn't just a king. He was this new thing, the emperor. So you come up with a new writing system. You standardize, for example, something as simple as the roads. They come up with a big road system, almost as good as what the Romans had. And it was all led like the Roman. It was actually legislated in terms of the width. All carriages had to have the same width so that the wheels would fit in the same ruts. They set up basically hotels or stage sets every 20 miles. They go for literally hundreds of miles in every direction. They centralize everything, weights. The weights and measures become centralized. So everywhere in China, 1 kilo is the same as 1 kilo everywhere else, which it hadn't been. Every place was always different. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to erase as many of those differences as possible and replace them with a universal, i.e. imperial system. Now, to a certain extent, Imperial Rome did something similar about the same time, but they never really got around. They never did it in a sophisticated fashion. It was much more haphazard and sort of, one emperor would decide to do this and one emperor would decide to do that. But in the case of China, it was this one guy that basically set up the entire imperial system. And you could argue that right in 2026 or 2027, Xi Jinping in quote, Communist or People's Republic of China is basically just a new version of Qin Shi Huangdi. Central authority in China hasn't changed since he invented it in 221 BC. And that's mind blowing when you think about it. Compared to European changes in politics, political system structures, I mean, it just goes on. There's never much continuity over maybe 200, 300 years, even in the Roman system. In the Chinese system, who sits in the chair changes, but the system never changes. Once he's come up with it, that's the system that stays in China. And so these buildings and these structures and structures like this are really important because they're manifestations of the power of the central state. And the interesting thing about that, of course, it doesn't matter who's sitting in the chair. That's the interesting thing about the Chinese system. I think he was rather cynical about that. He intended it to be his family, he hoped. I think deep down, realistically, he figured, shit was going to happen. But nonetheless, what you did is you made sure the system kept on running. So you might replace different clans, might come and sit in the chair. Different clans might name the country different things. But the actual bureaucratic structure never changed. And to a certain extent, it never collapsed. Even when the Mongols take over China in the 1300s, the first thing they do is they plop down the Mongol guy as the new emperor of China, like Kublai Khan, for example. But what does he do? He keeps the Chinese bureaucracy. Everyone comes in, they keep the bureaucracy. So the bureaucratic system never changed. It evolved. It didn't even evolve very much, to be honest. It just sort of, it changed the name. It changed who the address was on the top of the envelope. And in some cases, it's almost mind-blowing how much trouble he went to make this happen. This is the army, the bodyguard that we saw the images of in the mausoleum are actually about maybe about 1.5 miles, 2 miles off to this side. This is the actual central mausoleum, this mountain. I think it's like, originally the estimate, I think, was 600-700 feet tall. It's not quite, it's only 300 something now. This huge thing, it covers, here in Honolulu, would be everything from Waikiki to basically the lower edge of Palolo. It's one giant mountain. This is all artificial. This was flatland. It all was like this. He had this built. This is the central mausoleum of Qin Shi Huangdi. In the central area, it's never been excavated, is his mausoleum. And apparently, according to what everyone says, has a replica of his palace and a bunch of other stuff. So those guys we saw, the bodyguard, are actually, they're basically like beyond downtown Honolulu. They're blocks away from the action. And apparently there was, given how that was reconstructed, it's sort of mind-blowing to think what might be in here. So they basically built a reconstruction of his palace. Some sources say they'd actually built a reconstruction of the entire kingdom, the entire China, done in marble or who knows what. And then they buried the whole thing in literally hundreds of feet of dirt, all brought in by tens of thousands of people. This is for one guy. But he intended this to be a mountain in a flat area. Remember, this is Xi'an, this is all flat. You got this big bugger punked up there. This is what intended, his view is this was intended to remind everyone forever that one, he was the first emperor, and two, this is what imperial China meant. Because you have to remember when this went up, you have all those other palaces, you have a city of easily 1 million people in a place that really had probably just been a couple of villages that he had built entirely for the purposes of this new imperial state. The tomb sort of survives. A lot of the other stuff, the first emperor's warriors, all that stuff disappeared till the 1970s. But the bureaucracy, the structure he set up is still Chinese, still speak Hong or Putonghua, or it's sometimes what's called Mandarin Chinese. That's the Chinese that he's prescribed 2,000 years ago for people to speak. The writing system goes through some minor evolutions, but if you look at Qin Dynasty bamboo tablets, you can still read them if you can read modern Chinese. It's sort of like an archaic form, like say medieval English, but it's obviously the same thing. And none of that existed before. So it was a stunning achievement in that regard. Now, one of the other mindsets that he sets up is this idea of the inside and the outside. Um, and so and you think about China's outside, the Great Wall of China is it is what it is. We might get into that later, I'm not sure. But the thing is most important is that the Great Wall of China is actually the mountains and the deserts surround China. And within that is China, or if you would, the land of the Qin, the land of the Han. And so what you find throughout Chinese history, and still very much in the Chinese concept today, is the idea of inside and outside. Now, as we'll see when we get to the Japanese have a very similar concept, maybe in part borrowed from the Chinese. I'm not really too sure. But certainly there's some similarities. This is the city wall in Xi'an. Again, this is what's left of the capital of Chang'an. Xi'an now has, I believe, 10 million people. It actually takes up not much more space than the original city of Chang'an did, 1,500 years ago, because it's a much more high rise now. But this particular wall dates from the Ming Dynasty. So the actual extent wall in Xi'an dates from a period when the city was much smaller. It shrunk. It wasn't the capital anymore. But this wall's still intact. So this wall dates from the 1500s. And the key thing about this is, unlike a European wall, which is sort of fortifications, yeah, you've got a moat out here and you've got this really high wall. But if you're really persistent, it's not going to take a lot to get over this thing. The key thing about this wall is it's much more like a cyclone fence in a property. Inside of the wall, here's the gate tower. I think this is the West Tower. I can remember. Inside here on this side, you're inside China. You're inside the Chinese bureaucracy. There's curfews, there's rules, there's laws, and everyone has to follow them all the time. When you go outside the gate, you're outside of bureaucratic China. It's their version of the Wild Wild West. It doesn't necessarily think they're going to be bad. They might be better, but they won't be bureaucracy and they won't be China. So the Chinese set up walls, mental walls. These physical walls are like symbols of mental walls. There's the mental wall that's China versus the outside world. There's the walls that were cities versus the countryside. Families invariably lived in compounds, which had walls, and in most cases still do. So everything is walled. And so there's layers of outside and layers of inside. The walls of the mountains are Chinese, non-Chinese. The walls of a city are the bureaucratic imperial Chinese versus those that aren't. In a family compound, the wall inside is the family, the clan. Outside, it's everyone else. Now, there's the thing about this that makes it a very different concept than the Western thing, is it's not particularly ethnic. Chinese didn't, in many cases, really actually still don't particularly care who you are, whether you're Chinese, non-Chinese, whatever. You're either inside the system, you're outside the system. You're inside the city walls, you're outside the city walls. You're inside the clan compound, you're outside the clan compound. So you're part of the family or you're not. And if you're not, then it's real simple. Chinese have very much sort of a light switch attitude about stuff. You're either part of the system or you're not part of the system. There's no sort of maybes. If you would, the concept of friends and neighbors isn't really a big thing with China. Chinese tend to hang around with family much more. So the folks inside of the city aren't particularly interested in nearby cities. That's just, it's outside the city wall, it doesn't count. If it's outside the clan compound, it doesn't matter if it's the clan next door, it's outside of the clan. So it's a very different mental attitude than what you find in Europe. You're not going to find the equivalent of something like Paris or London, where we have neighborhoods and such like that. You do have neighborhoods in Xi'an, even today. but they tend to be historic neighborhoods. And even in that context, it's more of a way to describe where you are. It's not there's a lot of social relationships there. The social relationships are always clan, i.e., family. Oops, let's do this instead. I guess I'm playing games here and losing it. This is an image of one of the imperial thrones in the Forbidden City, i.e., more accurately, the Purple City in Beijing. And I can't remember which of the buildings. I think this is Heavenly Peace is the name of this particular structure. So this was in use till 1911. It's been preserved as a museum ever since then. But the key thing about this, and I couldn't really take a good picture of it, is that here's one of the imperial thrones, and there's a fair number of them here, but this is so only the emperor could sit in the seat. Now, unlike the Western thing, it wouldn't be like a throne, like say the British. I'm sure the British have a couple of thrones hanging around in the various castles. So on the one hand, they seem sort of similar. Only the emperor can put his butt in it. Only the king can put their butt in it. The difference is in the Chinese system, who sits in this isn't based on genealogy, as I mentioned before. It's based on, if you would, public performance reviews, I guess for lack of a better term. Now, what you don't see here is if you were to look straight up from this, if the emperor looks straight up, what you're going to find is this enormous carved dragon in the ceiling with the head hanging down. And he's got this big ball in his mouth, and it originally was silver or jade, depending on which one it is. And that's actually the pearl of immortality. And what it constantly reminded the emperor is when he looked up, is the dragon was a direct connection with his ancestors. So if you would, the emperors wanted 24/7 video maintenance or video surveillance by the ancestors to make sure that they performed their job. If they didn't, then all of a sudden they're going to find themselves dead, and there's going to be another clan sitting in that chair. But the only reason that new clan gets to sit in the chair is because the dragon and all his buddies, i.e., the ancestors, have decided they've got the mandate of heaven. So it's really chilling to look at these chairs, because if you sort of think about the history of them, a lot of different bodies were in those chairs. A lot of those bodies, very few of those bodies died naturally. And invariably was couched within, did you have the mandate of heaven, or have you lost the mandate of heaven? And if you want to end up in trouble in 2026 in China, go on to Weibo or TikTok or one of the other social media sites and type in that you think that the Communist Party has lost the mandate of heaven. You'll be shut down within about 2 milliseconds, and I can guarantee within a couple of minutes, there'll be some guys from internal security in leather jackets that want to have to talk with you. The Chinese, even today, even in the People's Republic, which is theoretically an entirely different system, have absolutely no sense of humor about the idea of the mandate of heaven. It still is taken deadly serious by everyone in China. So it's entirely different than the whole Western concepts of authority and rule and, rule of law or whatever. Rule of law has nothing to do with anything in China. It's authority is based on an entirely separate set of concepts. So if you're in charge of anything, this applies to companies too, not just the imperial system. If you're in charge of a company, it's because you've got sponsorship by folks that aren't alive anymore. And when something goes wrong, it's because you've somehow pissed them off or something happened. So Chinese tend to see themselves, the living are at the mercy of the ancestors in many ways. And so among the other things, the motivation of living is you have to do your best you possibly can to keep that relationship with those other folks, those other types of folks, I guess you might call it, good. So the Qin, it's hard to overemphasize how important Qin Shi Huangdi is. He totally standardized and structured the state and did such an incredible job when you think he's one guy. And he's not coming from some other place where you can see other logics like this. It's not like he has a bunch of models where people had done this before and he just sort of tweaked this or did that. He apparently just sat down and pretty much set this stuff up. He then hired a bunch of good advisors to make it all happen. but there's absolute clarity that this was his idea. For example, there seems to be general consensus that he actually thought up the different characters that still make up formal traditional Chinese script, because some of them are actually Qin characters, others are actually from the Chu and other states. So he took the characters of the, if you would, the writing system. He took different parts of it from different parts of his new empire. Um, Impressive guy. I mean, absolutely terrifying guy in terms of his willingness to just wipe out, maybe millions of people. But boy, one can't argue with efficiency, I guess. And so, to a certain extent, the Chinese always had sort of a love-hate relationship with Qin Shi Huangdi, or the first emperor. On one hand, they love to hate him. On the other hand, everyone seems to be in total agreement. The guy didn't mess around, and to a certain extent, results speak for themselves, I guess, for lack of a better term. So here's what I was just talking about. Notice how you get this model that just persists through Chinese history. And it's an interesting one because it's a uniquely Chinese model. Now, the interesting thing is when we get to Japan, we'll find this doesn't hold in Japan. The Japanese never give up the concept of clan. They make noise about it. They come up with a bureaucracy, but the Japanese are much more. The Japanese, maybe because they didn't have the Qin-PRC, I don't know, for whatever reason, they never buy into the idea of the bureaucracy. In the Japanese system, as we'll see, bureaucracy always takes second place to clan. In the Chinese system, the bureaucracy in many cases actually becomes more important than the clan. And this is something that the first emperor sort of intended, I think. Who knows? I mean, he's dead, and I'm among other folks, I don't talk to him. So here's your, just for whatever they're worth, since I frequently mention them without any details, here's your sort of your important key dynastic periods. The Qin Emperor and the empire starts up. If you notice, the Qin Empire only lasts till his son. Ironically, he sets this whole thing up. It works, and it lasts for about, I think, 8 years after he dies. And then what happens is a bunch of these other clans who weren't happy with the state of affairs go into civil war. It was a brutal period of the Warring States period. And the end result of all that is when the dust settles, is you end up with a new family in charge, a new clan in charge, and they're called the Han. The Han is still how the Chinese call themselves today. The interesting thing is the Han were just as brutal initially, but because they hadn't actually done this stuff, they're able to sidestep a lot of the bad PR, I guess you'd say, of the unification, so that the Han become what Chinese call themselves today, and the Chinese still see themselves as being the descendants of the Han Empire, which really is sort of unfair to Qin Shi Huang, but whatever's. This is probably most famous in the West because this is the first period of the Silk Road. It's the first Silk Road. The Han had a lot of trading networks with Rome, for example, especially silk, which the Romans loved. So there was movement back and forth. We don't find much evidence that the Euro-Western Asian system really had a lot of impact on the Chinese. I think because by the time the Han come to power, it's the same period as the Roman Empire, and I think in both cases they see themselves as so much success stories. They don't really see why there's a lot they want to borrow from someone else. And to be honest, that technology of things like silk and like stuff like that are centuries ahead of what you're going to find in Europe. So it just didn't apparently happen. Next big period, and this is probably the most important visually, at least especially from someplace like Xi'an, is the Tang Dynasty. This one's important for two reasons. One is it's the largest Chinese empire. It's the one that China still sees as being its height of sophistication. There really is an European equivalent. It'd be like a combination of Imperial Rome and Louis XI's Paris or something like that. It's so, the best music, the best art, the best this, the best that, the best poetry. Most of the really famous Chinese poets, a lot of them from the Tang. And again, Xi'an was still the capital, still called Chang'an back then. Even today, this is seen as the measure for modern sophistication and style. There's been a really interesting, usually called Han Fu movement, which is interesting because, again, Han being, it's the Han period. But then, and so what you find is it sort of goes through phases, but you still see it a lot in the cities. If you want to be really patriotic, what you do is you dress in very much an affectation. You dress in Tang Dynasty outfits. It's real popular 20 or 30 somethings, pretty much 30 somethings. In some ways, I suppose it's a little bit like cosplay. But in this case, what you're doing is you're trying to show that you actually identify with the sophistication and style of the Tang Dynasty. Now, again, if you go to Xi'an, if you go to the central district in Xi'an at night, especially on like Friday or Saturday nights, you'll go through there where they have these sort of reconstructed imperial center. And you'll see tons of folks, and they're all younger, dressed in this. And in most of these areas, including especially again Xi'an, you can actually find a bunch of stores where you can actually rent the outfits. So people will rent the outfit for a couple hours, especially the ladies will dress up in Tang Dynasty outfits and sort of show themselves as still reflecting this period of identity. Let me go and grab a couple pictures of this. So here's a couple of images. These are from the Huaqiang Hot Springs, which is a incredibly famous historic site in the outskirts of Xi'an. They have a big sort of reconstruction museum / thing there. So what you get is these poor folks have to dress up in these costumes for I think like 8 hours a day. I was asking one of the ladies, she was sort of reticent to actually say. This was in winter, so it was like 45 degrees even inside of this place. But these are Tang Dynasty outfits. And if you watch any Chinese costume dramas, if you go to YouTube and go to Youfu or any of the other big Chiwi or one of the other big sites, and you watch Chinese dramas, especially if you want to search these out, type in Detective D or Judge D mysteries, among other ones. And what you'll find is these are in many cases still sort of seen as the personification of style and sophistication. Everything from how things were laid out to everything about that is still, China still sees this as the most sophisticated, not necessarily the most powerful, but the most cultured and sophisticated. Oops, sorry about that. This is probably the most fascinating because the lady here was nice enough to actually say that they've been stuck there for 3 hours and they get like a 30-minute break. But the reason that's important is that this whole look is still today what the Chinese see as the epitome of being Chinese. And these are the outfits that you'll see, ladies dress up in all the time if they're going to like the Tang Dynasty Gardens or one of the other places where you see these enormous, I don't know, you wouldn't call them amusement parks. It's sort of like a combination of shopping malls and Disney and I don't know what else all rolled into one. But the interesting thing is what you find is the people that go there act as sort of like participants. So it'd be like going to Disneyland and dressing up in a Mickey Mouse outfit. Tons of folks do that. And it's especially right now it's getting a little older. It's the 30 somethings that I think are really into this. I haven't been back there in 8 years, so I'm pretty sure that's the group. But again, this whole style, it was a very complex place. If you notice the hairstyles, this is an imperial hairstyle of an attendant. Notice the girls back here, the mannequins. That's a servant's hairstyle. She's supposed to be either a top level concubine or an empress. I'm not sure which. I think I asked her and I forgot. But everything from the way things are laid out, everything here is the epitome of style. Now, it's probably sort of semi-accurate in terms of the elites. But the important thing is this is the way the Chinese today image their past. They don't image their past in terms of 50 years ago or 100 years ago. They image their past in terms of 700 AD, or if you would, 1400 years ago. Everything after that was sort of a letdown. It wasn't as sophisticated. It wasn't as stylish. It wasn't as this, that, or the other thing. And that would even be true today. I don't think anyone in modern China sees modern China as being stylish in the way that the Tang was. Yeah, so I mean, it's the Tang Dynasty. If you're dealing with China, a lot of stuff you bump into, even in Chinese costume dramas. There might be other periods, but if you look at the outfits and you know what you're looking at, you're actually looking at Tang Dynasty stuff, because even in modern Chinese TV dramas, If you want something to be historic and sophisticated, bang, it's Tong. There's no alternatives. It's like Wild West outfits if you do a Western movie. It just got there's a look. It doesn't matter if it's a Western epic of the 1870s or if it's something like was it Yellowstone or one of those modern ones where you're a modern cowboy like I've got out here in Carson City. They still dress like they still the look they carry is in large part the look of the 1870s because that's the real West. This is the real China. Okay. The later periods, the Yuan, that's actually when the Mongols come in. They very quickly take over China. So it's important to remember that a lot of periods in Chinese history, especially in later ones, were actually outsiders coming in. The Yuans come from Mongolia. They come from outside of that fence, if you would. And of course, to a certain extent, the Qin, the first emperor himself, came from sort of outside of the fence. The Yuan come in, they take over the place, but they keep the bureaucracy. And that's what Marco Polo and the Italians see when they come and see this place. Whoops, what happened there? Um, Sorry, I lost, bouncing around here. So then they get replaced. The Chinese revolt against the outsiders. And that becomes the Ming Dynasty, the last of the, Han Chinese dynasties. That collapses due to internal failure, just like all the rest of them. And what happens is ironically, Manchurian mercenaries brought in to fight the war for the Ming. Take one look at this place and decide, well, hell, this beats the hell out of Manchuria. Manchuria is cold as snot. It's even worse than Korea. And so they decide, why should we hang out there when we can hang out here? They very quickly wipe out the Ming Empire, take it over, and that becomes the Qing. Now, the interesting thing is the Qing are important for two reasons. One is that because that's the period of Western contact. So a lot of the Chinese stereotypes that you see in the West in the 19th and even early mid 20th century, the Chinese with queues, the braid down the back, the pillbox hat, those were actually put in place by the Qing. The Qing Empire. So if you ever go to the Forbidden City, the Purple City, it's important to remember that Chinese were never allowed in there. Right to the end of the Chinese, right until 1911, in the Qing dynasty, the only folks in authority were actually not Chinese. The Han Chinese were always servants. The Manchus, the Manchurians were always, it was their empire. And they ruled it with a brutal hand for, again, a couple of hundred years. And so one of the side effects is you find that they made the Chinese men wear those little round hats, which Chinese never wear those. They'd never seen them before. But in Manchuria, kids wear those. So they made the Chinese men wear that hat to remind them that they're children and they're not as good as the Qing. Han Chinese had to have a queue. It had to be braided hair. If that was cut, you'd be executed on the spot because that was considered revolution. Now, the other thing is Manchus didn't do that. Manchus tended to wear their hair loose. And I don't think I think they could cut it. I don't remember, to be honest, I don't remember. But this whole idea of what the West sees as Chinese, which actually were ethnic Chinese, though in many cases they're from South China, but they were Chinese who were getting out of China because China didn't belong to them. China was an occupied empire. And so if you were ethnic Chinese going somewhere else, whether it be Europe, whether it be the United States, whether it be Hawaii, wherever, was in many cases seen as being, it might not be better, but it sure as hell couldn't be any worse than what the Qing Empire was. So on one hand, the Qing Empire was very much a negative to the way the Chinese saw it, both before, well, especially after. Having said that, in the 21st century, the People's Republic has gone through a fair amount of effort to sort of spin the Qing Empire as being the last Chinese empire. I'm not really sure what that's about, and I think from a social political perspective, I think it's a really bad idea. So I'm not sure what the party's logic of this is. But if you look at the modern rhetoric, a lot of the Chinese parties, they portray the Qing as being the predecessors of modern China. Now, if you go back in Chinese history, Chinese went absolutely nuts at the idea that outsiders could actually be manifest, reality of the Chinese world. I think in part it's due to the fact that, like the Tang, though not quite as large, the Qing controlled a very large piece of real estate. And so, for example, in the modern China of 2026, what you find is the PRC argues that the borders that they should have in 2026 should be the borders that the Qing dynasty had in 1700, which are actually sort of the same dynasty, the borders that the Chinese had under the Tang dynasty in about 700 AD. Now, on one hand, this might make a little bit of sense, I suppose. I don't know why. But that'd be sort of like arguing if you're Italy, that you should control everything in Western Europe, including West Asia and all of North Africa, because that's what it was under the Roman Empire. So this idea of selective use of history for borders and political purposes, I don't really understand why the PRC doesn't use the Tang dynasty. If they're going to use one, I mean, that to most Chinese, that would make more sense if you want to talk about the now being a descendant of something. That would make more sense. The Qing, it's just that's weird. I've never figured out. That's only a spin of the last 20 years. Until about 2005, until about 15, 20 years ago, the PRC was really big on the fact that they were the descendants of the Tang. So also there was some movement in the party to suddenly decide the Qing were a good idea, which I don't understand. It makes no sense to me. But whatever, it is what it is. In the 20th century, what happens is the Qing dynasty collapses. I think there's some real big movie from the 1970s, I think it was The Last Emperor, something like that, which can sort of give you some of this. Again, we end up with those classic situations. Central Empire collapses, warlords come to power, civil war. It becomes much more complicated than it had in the past, simply from the standpoint that you now have to deal with the Europeans and also the Japanese, especially the Japanese and the Russians. So it isn't just an internal war. In the past, it always been sort of an internal conflict. Not this time. So the end result is that two things are really manifest here. One, if you're from Hawaii, then obviously the Sun Yat-sen, who's very much sort of like not quite the George Washington, but certainly the leader of the revolution, spent a fair amount of time on Maui, up in Keokea. Also was involved with the Aulani School. So Hawaii has a very close relationship with the 1911 revolution, not with the PRC, but the 1911 thing, which is, we don't have time in this class to get into that. However, the big thing here is in the late Qing dynasty, in the 19th century, they'd had a whole series of wars with the British, especially. But the European powers started to come in. They saw that Chinese central authority was collapsing. They come in and they take over chunks of China, set up really bad situations, especially the British, where basically they can sell drugs, i.e. opium, to the Chinese, and the Chinese government can't do anything about it. That's one of the big things that leads to the collapse of central authority. Everyone in the countryside's looking around thinking, well, shit, our government doesn't do squat. 1894, they lose a brutal war with Japan. 1904, the Japanese and the Russians go to war in China. That gives you some idea how little power China had by that period. 1910, Japan takes over Korea and Formosa, Taiwan. 1914, Japan takes over the German Chinese colonies, largely Tsingtao, which you might know for the beer. And so what happens is China, so when you get to Japan over the last 500 or 600 years, in several different periods in their history, have decided first Korea, but then also China is like it's like a big series of Amazon boxes sitting in front of someone's door, and there doesn't seem to be anyone home. So if you're really sort of mercenaries, they're like, well, why don't we just cruise by and if no one, we'll just grab them. So what happens is Japan ends up in a whole different series of conflicts, taking over Korea and eventually taking over China. And this, in its most spectacular form, is World War II, which starts in 1937 for all intents and purposes. In 1931, Japan takes Manchuria. In 1937, Japan manufactures the worst bullshit PR campaign in history. They literally blow up about 50 feet of railway in China. They actually have their own film guys there filming it while obviously Japanese guys in Japanese uniforms put up Japanese explosives, blow up part of a Chinese railway, and then said the Chinese had done it. And they actually then give out the film. It's like, dude, least you could do is, dress up in an outfit or something. So the end result, 1937, Japan invades China. By 1939, they've taken over 2/3 of the country. They've genocided huge parts of the population. The Nanjing massacre is a classic case in point, but it's just one of hundreds. Mind you, the rest of the world doesn't get into conflict, and that's with Nazi Germany in 1939, though the Japanese and the Germans were allies. 1941, World War II for the Americans starts with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, invasion of the Philippines, et cetera, invasion of the British colonies, et cetera. And at that point, then the Europeans decided to support the Chinese government forces, of which there's two groups. The government in the central region is the Kuomintang. The central government, as it's usually considered. In the north, it's the communist, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. 1945, the Japanese surrender, but that just then starts up. It's like even in World War II, the Kuomintang would just as happily attack the communists as they would the Japanese. It was insane. Chinese civil wars tend to be absolutely nuts. There's a bunch of Chinese examples in civil wars, even back in, say, the Tang Dynasty, where you end up with three different guys fighting each other at the same time. So you don't end up with two sides. You end up with three sides. It's like worldwide wrestling or something like that. It's just insane. 1945, Japanese surrender. Chinese Civil War just picks up back a war where it sort of paused out. 1949, the central Chinese state has collapsed, beaten, they leave. And in large parts because they lost the mandate of heaven. They weren't beaten militarily initially. They were beaten because the population decided the Kuomintang were full of shit and they weren't worth supporting anymore. They didn't have the mandate of heaven. Mao Zedong very quickly, when he comes to authority in 1949, sets itself up. Look at all the stuff in the period. He's very clear. He sets himself up as the new emperor. He makes it very clear he's got the mandate of heaven. It's not by accident that he sets up the People's Republic of China standing in the front gateway of the Purple City, where the Chinese emperors were. China goes through a period of absolutely insanity in the 60s and 70s. It's called the Red Guard period. Chinese families still don't talk about this. This was a period where families would rat on family members. It was absolutely insane. And it's just this huge nightmare that Chinese want to forget. 1978, Mao has died. His wife tries to come to power. That fails. And Deng Xiaoping comes to power. And so what happens is all of a sudden China now sort of turns into a new place. He really tries hard to not look like a new emperor. Very smart guy. It's hard to figure out what he thought was going to take place. I think he actually thought that China didn't need an empire, an emperor anymore, that a bureaucracy could survive on its own. Turned out he was wrong. The guys that replace him really want to be new emperors. So by the 1990s, especially late 1990s, Chinese society goes through these really rapid evolutions. He had brought in he'd gotten rid of the idea of everyone has to be the same, which is part of Mao's spin. And so he replaces it with, he actually has the classic slogan, which is making money is good. I've still got to find one of these signs somewhere and put it up somewhere. But by the 1990s, what's happened is there's not enough central authority and you don't have the imperial control that you had under, say, earlier dynasties. So what happens is everything sort of turns into anarchy. In some ways, it's actually very similar to what you find what happens in Russia when the Soviet Union collapses. Enormous disparities between wealth and poverty, educated and peasant. One of the big things still in China is being a party member or not. The guys that I work with in the archaeology authority in Shanxi, you have to be a party member to get above the rank of, flunky, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so they send you away for education. So party member is not an option in China in the 21st century. You have to be. Now, of course, it's even more complicated because now you have to be a party member of the right part of the party. So to a certain extent, what happens is the party has fallen into factions very much like clans. Right now, Xi Jinping's clan, if you want to think of it that way, is the right part of the Communist Party. And if you're part of other clans, then not infrequently, you get arrested, put in trial, and in many cases just sort of die and disappear. So it's actually sort of imperial China with a different wrapping. Um, all throughout Chinese society, social networks are key. Um, who you know has always been totally important in China. It's not who you are. So what you find is there's folks that make all their living. I would know a couple of these guys from Shanghai. They make their entire living off of who's on their phone. In the fact that if they've got someone on their phone, they text them, they'll immediately get a response. And they're wealthy, but they don't actually do anything. What they do is they put you in connection with someone else. They're brokers, networkers. Social networking has always been really key in China, um, and that's not changed. The wealth imbalance has become sort of mind blowing. In fact, let's sort of finish with that. So we'll go through some images pretty quickly. This is Nanjing Road, yeah. It's in Shanghai. This is the main shopping street. It's probably a little bit different. This is about 15 years ago. Just the idea of the wealth and the power, and this is the most successful city in China. And this is, high rises in Hong Kong, a classic sort of example of modern China, which you can find tons of examples of. So here you see Shenzhen. This is modern China. Again, my wife's family used to have a farm over here somewhere. I can't remember exactly. Maybe somewhere near this building, I think. They used to raise ducks. So this is all since 1990. This town didn't exist prior to that. So it's all part of this, new China, Deng Xiaoping's dream, if you would. And it's all literally brand new. So this is, if you would, this is successful China. And Shenzhen is still, if you want to make money, Shenzhen is still the city you go to. It's right across literally the fence from Hong Kong. Now, by contrast, where we're doing some of our research is out in Sunyi. This is north of Xi'an. This is actually a good-sized town. Chunghua actually it's a city. But this is what most of it looks like. You notice you still got mud brick. A lot of the houses are mud brick. Most of the streets might have paving in the center, but I've very few Chinese outside of the major cities. I've never seen paved sidewalks. This just isn't the way it works. This is what you find when you go around the back of a house. This isn't. These folks aren't necessarily poor, but even here, this is the main drag in Binxiang, which is a big town. You compare that to Shenzhen and Shanghai, it's like two entirely separate worlds. The way people dress, their options for the future, levels of education, party membership. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And there's not much of actual comparison that takes place. This is the reality of the majority of China. The majority of China still looks like this. And one of the huge problems the Chinese party has and the Chinese government has is you still live under this concept of mandate of heaven. If you don't keep all these people at least vaguely satisfied, or at least some promise that the future of their kids is going to be better than theirs, then these folks here are not going to back you anymore. They're not sure what they're going to want instead, but the scary thing is they would rather have anarchy than have you. And so this is the reality of the Chinese state. It's not based on political systems. It's not based on, voting power. It's not based on lobbying efforts. It's based entirely on the perception of all these people, the millions and millions and millions of Chinese. If they decide that Xi Jinping and the other guys in Beijing aren't doing a good job, then they'll pull the plug on it. And there's absolutely nothing that the party can do about it. And this is the reality of the Chinese state. This is why Chinese politics and Chinese social dynamics are entirely different. And this is why when someone like, I don't care whether it's President Biden, President Trump, President whoever's next comes into power, Americans have never understood then in a weird way, the Chinese and the Americans are very similar because they're based on populist identity. But the difference is where American populist identity is very much within rule of law and you got to vote and stuff like that most of the time. For example, the riots in the Capitol back a couple of years ago, the Chinese wouldn't even think anything of that. That's except that would be the first of 150 years of riots. So the idea that you've got central authority and there's rules to follow. In the Chinese attitude, you've only got rules as long as you think you should have rules. The minute you don't think the rules work anymore, then screw the rules. And off we go to the races again. And this is the huge nightmare of the Communist Party. Xi Jinping and the central authority are only in power as long as they can convince everyone that they're the best option. But then what replaces them is not another group in power necessarily. It might very well be an entirely different system. Yeah, so I mean, the Chinese system is not the same. It's totally, totally, totally different.